They called me street garbage. My father-in-law, my husband, a room full of billionaires, laughing at me like I didn't belong. I stayed silent, but I wasn't powerless. What they didn't know. While I was small in their world, I was building something that would shake theirs completely. A stolen medical formula. A legacy buried for decades. And I had the power to return it to the people who needed it most. The same billionaires who humiliated me? They came crawling, begging me to fix what they'd ignored. But I wasn't seeking revenge. I was claiming justice. If you think they can define your worth, think again. Watch what happens when courage, intelligence, and moral clarity meet opportunity. Speech balloon comment below, have you ever been underestimated and came back stronger? As we dive into the story, please subscribe. Sierra Monroe had never belonged anywhere, not in the polished suburbs where her father's absence had left a hole, not in the high school hallways where cliques whispered about her thrift store dresses, and certainly not in the world she would soon step into. Growing up on the south side of Chicago, she learned early that life wasn't fair, and respect was never handed over, it was earned, often through sheer grit and quiet endurance. Her mother worked 2 jobs, sometimes 3, just to make ends meet. By day she was the cashier at the corner grocery store, by night she cleaned offices downtown. Sierra would watch her mother return home exhausted, shoulders heavy, eyes tired but determined, and she learned that perseverance wasn't glamorous, it was survival. Her father had left when she was 6, a quiet abandonment that left a void filled with questions she didn't have answers for. She became independent faster than most kids her age, understanding instinctively that the world owed her nothing, and she had to carve her own path. Sierra threw herself into her studies, into her community, into every opportunity to make a difference. She became a social worker, motivated by the people she grew up around, the overlooked, the undervalued, those whom society had quietly decided didn't matter. She worked at a community shelter, barely making enough to cover her rent in a cramped studio apartment with peeling paint and a radiator that hissed more than it warmed. But she loved it. She loved the people she helped. She loved the feeling of making a small, meaningful dent in the lives of others when no one else seemed to care. Her days were long, her nights often longer, and she rarely took time for herself. Yet, there was a spark inside her, a drive for more than just survival. She wanted to prove that you could come from nothing and still command your place in the world. And that drive, quiet but unwavering, would lead her to a world she had never imagined. It began at a charity gala downtown. Sierra had been dragged along by her supervisor, who insisted it would be good for networking. She had stood awkwardly in a corner, feeling painfully underdressed in a simple navy sheath dress while guests floated around in gowns and designer suits that seemed plucked from magazine covers. She was sipping lukewarm champagne when a man approached her, tall, confident, and surprisingly unassuming. His smile was genuine, his interest in her work sincere. "Tell me about what you do," he said, not as a formality, but like he actually wanted to understand. Sierra found herself talking for nearly an hour, sharing stories of families she had helped, children she had fought to protect, the systemic injustices she had spent years battling. And he listened. Every word. He asked questions, but not the shallow, rehearsed kind that people like him often did. No, he was present. Fully present. "I'm Ethan Westfield," he said finally, extending his hand. "I come from a family business. Not something I usually talk about on a first meeting. But you deserve honesty." It was refreshing, almost surreal. For once, she wasn't being sized up for what she lacked or judged for where she came from. She gave him her number, thinking nothing more of it than the polite acknowledgement of an intriguing conversation. The calls came the next day. And then the next. For 3 months, their relationship unfolded like a normal one. Coffee shops, evening walks, casual movies. He met Tamara, her best friend since childhood, and her approval mattered more than Ethan's wealth ever could. Sierra felt something she hadn't allowed herself to believe in a long time, genuine connection. She trusted him, and in her world, that was a luxury she rarely afforded anyone. But as the leaves turned in late September, Ethan's demeanor shifted slightly during one dinner at their favorite Italian restaurant. He reached across the table, took her hand, and said, "Sierra, there's something I need to tell you about my family." She felt her stomach drop. She didn't expect money, she had learned early not to covet it, but there was a caution in his tone that made her pulse quicken. "My last name, it's Westfield." "Westfield Pharmaceuticals," he said quietly. Well, my family is wealthy. Billionaires. Hospitals, foundations, museum wings, the works." Sierra blinked, momentarily stunned. The revelation could have changed everything, but she understood why he had hidden it. He wanted her to know him first, without the distraction of wealth. He had been burned before by people who only saw dollar signs. She nodded slowly, choosing to trust her instincts. She wasn't scared of money itself, she was scared of a world that operated on rules she hadn't been taught, a world that could judge her before even learning her name. 6 months later, she received an invitation she had dreaded but knew was inevitable: Ethan's 32nd birthday dinner at the Westfield family estate. This was no ordinary home, it was a statement. Marble floors, crystal chandeliers, staff in uniforms, walls lined with ancestral portraits. Every inch of it whispered that she didn't belong. Tamara came over the night before, helping her practice walking in heels she wasn't accustomed to wearing. "You belong anywhere you choose to stand, Sierra. Don't let them make you feel small," she said, holding Sierra's face in her hands. Sierra clung to those words as she left the next evening. The dining room was set for 20. Ethan led her in, holding her hand like it was a lifeline. Polite greetings, air kisses from his mother, Catherine, ice wrapped in pearls. Harold, his father, gave her a nod that felt like dismissal. And then there was Sterling Crawford, an older man whose reputation in business preceded him. The air was electric with unspoken judgments, and Sierra could feel it settling on her like a weight. At first, conversation was small, careful, almost pleasant. Then Harold's tone shifted, subtle but cutting. Questions about her education, her upbringing, her job. "So, this is fulfilling work," he said, the kind of tone that made her accomplishments seem like a quaint hobby. Ethan squeezed her hand under the table, silent. Then came the announcement of a business merger, plans for Ethan to marry strategically, to align with suitable partners from families that understood their world. A young woman's name was mentioned, casually, as if she didn't exist. Sierra's voice, steadier than she felt, cut through the tension. "Excuse me, but Ethan and I are together. We love each other." A hush fell. Crystal clinked against china. Someone coughed. Harold turned, and the words left his mouth like a weapon. "You think love matters in families like ours? You're a distraction, Miss Monroe. Street garbage. You don't belong here." The words hit harder than anything she had ever experienced. She searched Ethan's eyes for defense, for anything. He was frozen, red-faced, silent. Sterling Crawford laughed, echoing Harold's cruelty. Catherine studied her wine glass like it held the universe's secrets. Sierra stood, trembling, but resolute. "Thank you for dinner," she said, placing her napkin on the table and walking out. Not fast, not ashamed, but deliberate. She walked into a taxi, and only then, when the doors shut, did the tears come. For 2 weeks, she immersed herself in work, avoiding calls from Ethan, drowning in files, schedules, and the tangible satisfaction of helping those who truly needed her. That was when she met Geneva Clark, an elderly woman seeking shelter for the night. Her hands shook, her voice trembled, but her eyes held dignity. Geneva revealed a story that would change Sierra's life: decades-old pharmaceutical research, a rare blood disorder disproportionately affecting Black and Brown communities, and a stolen formula that had been buried for 30 years. Geneva needed Sierra, the strong, determined, angry, and smart young woman, to fight the battle she no longer could. Sierra listened, shocked and resolute. Her mission was clear. Her path, fraught with risk, had begun. And though she didn't yet know it, the humiliation at that dinner, the laughter, the dismissals, all of it would become the fire that forged her power. She had been underestimated. She had been called nothing. But she was about to prove that sometimes, the people who seem weakest are the ones capable of changing the world. Your beginnings do not define your potential. Sierra didn't sleep well that night. Her small studio apartment, usually a sanctuary, felt like a prison. Every corner echoed with Harold Westfield's words, "street garbage." The sting of humiliation was sharp, a physical ache she couldn't shake. Yet beneath it, something began to smolder, a quiet, burning determination that whispered, "They don't define you. You define yourself." The next morning, Sierra arrived at the community shelter before dawn, slipping into her routine with mechanical precision. But today, even folding blankets and sorting donations, she felt different. She had been underestimated, belittled, dismissed, but for the first time, she realized that those judgments were powerless unless she allowed them to be. And she would not. Not anymore. Weeks passed. Sierra buried herself in work, refusing to return Ethan's calls, ignoring the social media chatter that whispered about the dinner, and focusing on the lives she could still touch directly. But she wasn't alone in this growing storm. Geneva Clark continued visiting the shelter, bringing folders, notebooks, and stories of research lost, of injustice unrighted. Sierra devoured every detail, every page, every hint of opportunity to make things right. One afternoon, Geneva leaned on her cane and placed a trembling hand on Sierra's shoulder. "Sierra, they took everything from me. My work, my husband, my peace. But you have something they don't. You have fire, and you have brains. You can fix this." Sierra nodded, swallowing a lump in her throat. She felt the weight of responsibility, but also a sense of clarity. For the first time in her life, she wasn't working to survive or to please anyone. She was working to right a wrong, to bring justice. Her first step was understanding the battlefield. Geneva's files revealed that the stolen formula, a treatment for a rare blood disorder, was tied directly to Westfield Pharmaceuticals. The research had been buried in their archives, hidden from public scrutiny, while patients continued to suffer. And yet, if leveraged correctly, this information could destabilize the company, expose ethical violations, and force them to act. Sierra realized the irony. The same empire that had mocked her could become the instrument of justice, if wielded wisely. She reached out to Leonard Price, a lawyer who owed her a favor from her volunteer work at the local legal aid society. Leonard was meticulous, analytical, and, most importantly, unimpressed by wealth or status. Within 3 days, he called her, excitement mixed with gravity. "Sierra, this isn't just solid. It's airtight. Westfield Pharmaceuticals has been under FDA scrutiny for years, but this could be the leverage they can't ignore." Sierra felt a thrill, but also a cautious responsibility. This wasn't about revenge. It was about justice, about restoring Geneva's work, about ensuring that something that could save lives didn't remain buried. And yet, she knew she had to tread carefully. One misstep could destroy her credibility, and worse, hurt those she wanted to protect. Meanwhile, Ethan continued to try and reach her. Messages, calls, even a brief, awkward appearance at the shelter. Sierra didn't respond. His silence at the dinner had been deafening, and she wasn't ready to forgive, nor was she ready to engage with the wealth and power that had humiliated her. Her focus was singular, Geneva's research and the lives it could save. Sierra began mapping a strategy. She documented every piece of evidence, compiled it into a comprehensive dossier, and reached out to nonprofit organizations dedicated to affordable healthcare. She identified partners who could develop the formula, distribute it equitably, and maintain transparency. She set up encrypted communications, bank accounts under her name, and a project plan that would protect Geneva's legacy and her own safety. Each step required ingenuity. She had to navigate a world that wasn't her own, one of corporate bureaucracy, media scrutiny, and billionaire egos, all while maintaining her humility and integrity. She reached out to whistleblowers, independent scientists, and advocacy groups. Slowly, the plan coalesced. One evening, as Sierra pored over a stack of documents in her apartment, she realized she was no longer the timid, overlooked girl who had walked into the Westfield estate. She was calculating, focused, and driven by a purpose greater than herself. She was not seeking wealth, nor status, nor recognition. She was seeking justice and the opportunity to make a tangible difference. News of Geneva's research began to leak, not intentionally, but through careful networking with ethical scientists and journalists who understood the magnitude of the discovery. Articles began circulating quietly in scientific journals, highlighting a lost formula with the potential to save thousands of lives in underserved communities. Social media posts began gaining traction, painting the story of an overlooked researcher whose work had been buried due to systemic negligence. Sierra watched, cautiously optimistic, as public attention began to mount. The response from Westfield Pharmaceuticals was swift. Internally, executives scrambled to contain potential fallout. Stock prices wavered. Rumors spread of ethical violations and mismanagement. Harold Westfield, the man who had once called her street garbage, was suddenly faced with a problem that couldn't be laughed away. Sierra remained calm, strategic. She continued building relationships with nonprofits, ensuring that Geneva's work could be developed and distributed without interference. Every move was calculated, every communication precise. She wasn't seeking vengeance, she was creating an outcome that would correct a historic injustice and empower the vulnerable. Then came the turning point. The FDA issued preliminary inquiries into Westfield Pharmaceuticals, focusing on ethical concerns that aligned directly with Geneva's research. Media outlets began picking up the story, framing it as a case of a pharmaceutical giant exploiting proprietary research while patients suffered. Public pressure mounted, and social media amplified the narrative. It was during this period that Sierra received an unexpected call from Sterling Crawford, the billionaire who had laughed at her during that fateful dinner. His tone was measured, professional, but laced with concern. "Miss Monroe, I understand you've acquired information that could affect multiple stakeholders. I want to ensure this is handled responsibly." Sierra listened, carefully. Crawford's investment empire was at risk, and he recognized her as a force to be reckoned with. She responded diplomatically, asserting that her goal was not profit or fame, it was justice for Geneva and equitable access to the medication. Crawford, begrudgingly respectful, agreed to remain neutral, his empire dependent on Westfield's stability but aware of the growing public pressure. Throughout it all, Ethan continued attempting contact. Calls, messages, even emails. Sierra did not answer. She was no longer the woman defined by his wealth or the validation of others. She was a strategist, a protector of justice, and the architect of change. Her focus remained on the formula, on Geneva, and on creating a system that prioritized human life over profit. Weeks later, Sierra convened a virtual meeting with representatives from nonprofit foundations, ethical investors, and independent pharmaceutical developers. She presented the formula, the documented research, and a comprehensive plan for development and distribution. The response was overwhelmingly positive. Funding was secured, partnerships formed, and a timeline established for production and distribution. It was a triumph born not of wealth or status, but of intelligence, persistence, and moral courage. Sierra had navigated a world that had once sought to diminish her, using only her knowledge, her conviction, and her determination to effect change. And yet, she knew the most challenging part was still ahead, confronting the Westfield family, the very people who had mocked her, dismissed her, and attempted to assert dominance over her life. She would enter their world again, but this time, not as a victim, not as an outsider, and not as a powerless participant. She would enter as an equal, armed with truth, purpose, and the leverage to ensure justice was served. It was about reclaiming power, asserting her worth, and setting the stage for a confrontation that would expose privilege, arrogance, and corruption. The fire that Harold Westfield had ignited with his cruelty had transformed into a force for change, one that no wealth, no title, and no dismissive laughter could extinguish. She paused one evening, looking over the Chicago skyline from her modest apartment balcony, reflecting on how far she had come. The girl who had once been called street garbage was now a force shaping the lives of thousands, a protector of justice, and a symbol of resilience. She was no longer defined by the opinions of others. She was defined by her courage, her integrity, and her willingness to act when no one else would. And deep down, she knew the Westfields would soon learn what she already understood: underestimating someone with fire, intelligence, and moral clarity was the gravest mistake they could ever make. Confidence grows through action and proof, not approval from those who dismiss you. Sierra Monroe had spent months building a fortress of strategy, information, and allies, yet nothing could fully prepare her for the day she returned to the Westfield estate. The memory of Harold's words still lingered in her mind: street garbage, a reminder of the arrogance she had faced. But this time, she wasn't coming to plead, apologize, or shrink herself. She was coming to confront reality with clarity and purpose. She arrived in a taxi, dressed simply yet confidently, the kind of attire that said she belonged because she owned herself, not because of gowns or jewels. The valet, recognizing her, seemed hesitant, unsure how to treat her. Sierra smiled politely but ignored the subtle stares. She had no need for validation from anyone in that house. The grand entryway looked the same: marble floors, towering ceilings, ancestral portraits glaring down, but the energy had shifted. Inside, the air was tense, as if the walls themselves anticipated confrontation. Harold Westfield, Sterling Crawford, Catherine, and Ethan were all gathered in the dining room. Their faces reflected surprise, unease, and in some cases, the faintest glimmers of fear. Sierra entered, holding a folder containing Geneva's research, legal documentation, and evidence of Westfield's ethical missteps. Every step she took resonated with quiet authority. She didn't need to shout. She didn't need to plead. She merely needed to be present, and her presence carried weight. Ethan stood to greet her, eyes wide with emotion, but she didn't allow distraction. Her focus was on justice. Harold's smirk faltered the moment Sierra opened her folder and laid the documents on the table. He leaned in, attempting to regain composure, but the documents, decades of hidden research, proof of systemic negligence, and public pressure mounting online, spoke louder than any words could. "Your company has been exploiting Geneva Clark's research for decades," Sierra began, her voice steady, unwavering. She dedicated her life to saving lives, and her work was stolen, buried, and ignored because it didn't suit your profit margins. Harold opened his mouth, but Sierra continued before he could interrupt. "You've built an empire on brilliance and blood, but brilliance without ethics is hollow. I'm not here for revenge, I'm here to restore justice. Geneva's formula will be developed, distributed, and her legacy acknowledged. Publicly. You have a choice: support this initiative and participate ethically, or face the consequences of inaction. Your stock is already faltering, the FDA is investigating, and social media will not forgive continued negligence." Sterling Crawford's hand trembled as he sipped his drink. "Miss Monroe, this is serious. You're holding leverage that could topple an empire." Sierra nodded. "Leverage? No. This is accountability. This is righting wrongs. And if you don't act, the world will." The room was silent. Ethan stepped forward, placing a hand on hers. "Sierra. I should have stood up for you that night. I was weak. I was scared of my family's judgment, but I choose you. I've left the comfort of their world. I choose love, integrity, and justice over their legacy of arrogance." Her chest tightened. She had not come here for reconciliation, yet the sight of Ethan, transformed by genuine remorse and commitment, softened her resolve just slightly. "I will work with you," she said, "but only if our actions serve Geneva and the people who need her research. Not family ego. Not legacy. Not profit." Harold's face turned red with fury, but it was Sterling who broke first, pleading for compromise. Catherine, surprisingly, offered a quiet apology, a subtle acknowledgement that she had underestimated Sierra's intelligence and resolve. Negotiations followed, not as a debate about wealth or power, but as a conversation about responsibility, justice, and morality. Sierra's terms were simple yet uncompromising: Geneva's name must be restored on every publication and product, the research must be developed affordably and ethically, and a scholarship fund for underrepresented students in pharmaceutical sciences must be established. The foundation overseeing the formula would retain control to ensure compliance. Weeks later, Sierra watched as the first production batch of Geneva's medication left the labs. She had secured partnerships, funding, and oversight, ensuring that lives would be saved in communities that had been ignored for decades. The world finally saw what had been hidden, and the narrative shifted. Public opinion favored justice, not power. Harold Westfield faced his downfall with public scrutiny, corporate investigations, and plummeting stock prices. Sterling Crawford's reputation suffered due to prior complicity. Catherine continued to reconcile with the reality that humility and acknowledgement could build bridges where arrogance had only built walls. Sierra, meanwhile, returned to her apartment, exhausted but invigorated. She had not only restored justice but proven to herself that intellect, morality, and courage were more powerful than wealth, status, or legacy. She was no longer defined by their words. She had transformed her humiliation into action, her anger into strategy, and her courage into impact. Months passed. The public success of Geneva's formula brought widespread recognition, but Sierra remained grounded. She continued her work at the community shelter, mentoring young women and advocating for systemic change. Ethan, now committed to his own moral and ethical path, taught at an inner-city school, giving back in ways that mattered more than money ever could. Sierra and Ethan grew together, not as a product of family influence, but as partners united by shared values and genuine love. Their relationship was quiet, powerful, and grounded in respect. They had weathered the storm of arrogance, wealth, and societal expectations, emerging stronger and wiser. The Westfield estate remained a reminder of past humiliation, but Sierra no longer feared it. She had returned, not to bow or apologize, but to reclaim dignity, assert justice, and create systemic change. The empire that had tried to diminish her was forced to recognize the power of integrity, intelligence, and resilience. Sierra often reflected on what she had learned. True power was not wealth or influence, it was knowledge, courage, and moral clarity. Real love required choice, not convenience. Justice was worth pursuing even when the path was long and fraught with risk. And above all, your worth was never defined by others, but by how fiercely you stood for. On Sierra expanding her impact, mentoring others, and consolidating her position as a moral and intellectual leader. Sierra's influence continued to grow. She leveraged her success with Geneva's formula to create a foundation that identified overlooked talent, particularly in communities historically excluded from science, technology, and entrepreneurship. She hosted seminars, gave talks at universities, and became a sought-after speaker on ethics, strategy, and empowerment. The media dubbed her the advocate who outwitted billionaires, but Sierra remained humble, redirecting attention to the people her initiatives served. Ethan worked alongside her in community projects, not as a partner overshadowed by wealth, but as a committed ally who valued ethical responsibility over social prestige. They established programs offering mentorship, funding, and exposure to aspiring scientists, ensuring that Geneva's legacy extended beyond the formula to future generations of innovators. Meanwhile, Harold and Sterling were forced to reckon with their failures. Westfield Pharmaceuticals underwent restructuring, ethical oversight was enforced, and public accountability became non-negotiable. Catherine, once cold and calculating, expressed genuine regret and worked with Sierra on educational initiatives, showing that even those who falter can be redirected toward meaningful action. Sierra's life became a testament to resilience and moral fortitude. She realized that true success was not in wealth accumulation or social status, but in creating lasting, positive impact. Her story inspired thousands, particularly young women, to recognize that intelligence, ethics, and perseverance could overcome systemic barriers and personal humiliation. Sierra walked into the community center she helped fund, sunlight spilling through the windows. Children and young adults filled the space, eager for knowledge, mentorship, and opportunity. She paused, watching a girl present her first science project, and a boy explain his innovative approach to a medical device prototype. Each success reminded Sierra why she had endured humiliation, skepticism, and social pressure. Ethan joined her, a quiet smile on his face. "Look at them," he said. "You've changed everything." "No," Sierra corrected softly. "They changed everything. We just gave them a platform to be seen." She thought of Geneva, the woman who had trusted her with a lifetime of work, and of the countless overlooked individuals she had uplifted. Justice had been served, but more importantly, lives had been transformed. Sierra realized the ultimate revenge, if one could call it that, was not in destruction or humiliation, it was in thriving, creating, and uplifting others while remaining true to oneself. The Westfields, once symbols of ridicule and power, had been forced to acknowledge the consequences of their arrogance. Harold Westfield's empire was diminished, Sterling Crawford's reputation tarnished, but Sierra's moral victory was complete. She had reclaimed dignity, restored justice, and established a legacy of integrity. Walking home that evening, Sierra reflected on what she had learned. The world may try to define you, belittle you, or dismiss your worth, but the measure of a person is how they respond. Courage, intelligence, moral clarity, and resilience are more valuable than wealth, influence, or social standing. True love chooses character over comfort. And real success is measured not by what you acquire, but by what you give and whom you empower along the way. Sierra Monroe had started as a girl underestimated, humiliated, and dismissed. She had become a woman who transformed injustice into action, anger into purpose, and humiliation into triumph. And she knew, with absolute certainty, that nothing, neither wealth, arrogance, nor the judgments of others, could ever define her again. Her story became a beacon for thousands, a reminder that worth is inherent, courage is transformative, and the greatest victories are measured not in revenge, but in impact, integrity, and self-realization. Success is measured by impact, empowerment, and moral clarity, not titles or social status.